Virginia. The overall goals of the Land is Forever project are to understand private landowner preferences for new voluntary conservation tools, to investigate existing tools and structures to expand their use in the European Union, and to identify new and innovative policies and tools that would encourage more landowners to participate in conservation activities. The Land is Forever project is being carried out jointly by ELO, the European Landowners Organization, which is the largest organization representing the interests of European landowners through multidisciplinary programs for landowners and land managers, and the Nature Conservancy, which is the largest private conservation organization dedicated to protecting the lands and waters on which all life depends. Originally, we had planned an in-person US study tour within the work plan of the Life is Forever project, and it was designed to bring European landowners and others to see firsthand conservation projects that were being undertaken in the US. We'd hoped that such a study tour would increase understanding and provide an opportunity to share lessons learned and compare conservation tools in the US with those in Europe. But unfortunately, an intervening pandemic got in the way. And because of the pandemic, we are now trying to have a virtual study tour to share with you information about the projects that we're doing. The US study tour will be rescheduled to the spring of 2021, we hope, assuming that travel is permitted by then. We will communicate on the tour, this new tour, as soon as possible to plan and travel safely. As I mentioned, there are 4 webinars in this series. The first webinar was on Monday, where we visited conservation projects in Maryland. Today, in our second session, we will visit the state of Virginia and conservation projects that are being undertaken there. On Monday, September 28th, in webinar 3, we will look at innovative case studies of private land conservation in Europe. And our final session will be on Wednesday, September 30th. In session 4, we will focus on, is there a future for private land conservation tools in Europe? More information on the webinars can be found on the ELO website and the Land is Forever website. Just a word about the conservation projects that you're going to be hearing about today. Some of the broad themes and approaches that are illustrated by the private land conservation projects that you're going to hear about include collaborative partnerships between conservation organizations and private landowners, the use of conservation easements and other kinds of cooperative management agreements, ownership and management of land by NGOs as nature preserves and other kinds of protected areas, the role of conservation science in private land management, and the importance of financial and tax incentives in private lands conservation. You will be able to type questions at the bottom of the screen under the Q&A button, and we will address them at the end of the presentations by the panelists. Now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Sam Lindblom, who's the Director of Land Management for the Nature Conservancy in Virginia, who will introduce the other panelists. Sam, over to you.
Okay, there we go. I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes, we hear you, Sam.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Now let me. Oh, I'm having a little. I need to share my screen. Give me just a moment. Okay, there we go. Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. I think, should everyone see a map of the Eastern United States and Virginia? Marie, do you see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about the delay. My name is Sam Lindblom. As Phil mentioned, thank you, Phil. I am the Director of Land Management for the Virginia chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And today we're going to visit 3 places in Virginia that we're very proud of. We're going to extend upon a trip to the eastern shore of Virginia, to the southern Delmarva Peninsula, where the Virginia chapter of the Conservancy operates the Virginia Coast Reserve. And from there, we will travel across the Chesapeake Bay to a landscape known as the Virginia Pinelands, where we're going to talk to Brian Van Eerden and Bill Owens about our longleaf pine restoration efforts there. And after that, we will travel up to visit Oxbow Farm in the northern part of Virginia at the tip of Shenandoah National Park near Front Royal, Virginia. And we'll hear from Amy Johnson about Oxbow Farms. We're very excited about all three of these places. So without further ado, we'll start down in on the lower Delmarva Peninsula on the Eastern Shore with Jill. Jill is the director of the Virginia Coast Reserve, and she leads a very dynamic, multifaceted program out there on the Eastern Shore aimed at restoring and maintaining some of the best barrier island landscapes left on the eastern United States. Jill?
Great, thanks, Sam. Yeah, if you'll go to the next slide. I'm really going to talk about, good afternoon to everybody. Good morning to those of you on the East Coast here. I'm really thrilled to speak to you about one of the most special places on the planet, in my point of view, the Virginia Coast Reserve. And I'm going to do a pretty high level look back at really the impact that 50 years of land protection has had on our local as well as global efforts with land protection and using this place as a living laboratory. Sam, if you'll go to the next slide, and it's a Google Earth. We're going to zoom in just to remind you that you're on the East Coast. We're on the East Coast of the United States. Our colleagues from the Maryland Nature Conservancy on Monday talked about the Delmarva Peninsula, which of course is a peninsula of land that has portions of the states of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. I'm highlighting that southern portion of the Delmarva Peninsula, the Virginia portion. This is a 75-mile-long peninsula with the Chesapeake Bay to the west and the Atlantic Ocean to the east. Brownsville Preserve is the Nature Conservancy's headquarters here at the Virginia Coast Reserve. And this is a pretty rural landscape. There are about 50,000 people that live in these two counties and very spread out. Sam, if you'll go to the next slide. And it really is the last expanse of coastal wilderness, at least on the east coast of the United States. And this map of that peninsula really shows that conservation. There are 133 acres of land in this 75-mile-long peninsula that are protected. 40,000 of those acres are owned or managed by the Nature Conservancy. So if you look on the map, those properties that are shown in green are areas or parcels, properties that the Nature Conservancy owns and manages outright. And then those in blue designate those private lands that are held in conservation easement by the Nature Conservancy. We also have other partners. We have a local land trust and other partners here that also hold conservation easements on private lands. And in total, that's 30,000 acres of private lands held here in conservation easement. And you know, to really get the story of the Virginia Coast Reserve, it's important to point out all of these partnerships. You know, our federal partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, shown in orange at the southern end and the northern end as Fish and Wildlife refuges. Our state-owned land, shown in purple, which is mostly extensive salt marsh on both the Atlantic seaside and the Chesapeake Bay side. So it really does, we manage this area in great long-term partnerships, including with private landowners. So that's really what has driven 50 years of work here at the Virginia Coast Reserve, which I'm going to talk about. And I will say I'm going to use some video clips because no one can talk about this place better than other staff and our partners, just to show you sort of that cohesiveness of this network of people working on conservation here. So next slide, please. This place, this rural landscape and the amount of conservation and protected lands that we have is really a place that we have demonstrated positive economic impact. In 2017, we had an independent study done that really shows that both Northampton and Accomack counties here on the Eastern Shore of Virginia are positively impacted both directly through tax revenue, through all those conservation easements, directly because so many of us live and work here and add to the economy that work in conservation and land protection field. And then indirectly, we have a booming ecotourism business. People come to visit the quiet nature of this area, to birdwatch, to fish, all of those things. And this picture shows aquaculture. We have the largest clam aquaculture industry in the country, in the United States. And that's really due to the fact that we have incredible water quality on the east coast of, off the coast of the Virginia Coast Reserve. And that allows this thriving business to add about $50 million annually to our very small rural economic budget. So a place where we have demonstrated this positive economic impact. Sam, next slide, please. With the ownership of all this land and all of these partnerships, we have a responsibility to manage this land. And we really, you know, the barrier islands, the marshes, the mudflats, the uplands, the forests, all of that is home to a lot of migratory species. And we manage that as one of the most important coastal regions for migratory birds. And I'll let our partner at the Center for Conservation Biology tell you a story about that. Next slide and video, please.
We're lucky that we have the Virginia Coast Reserve, and we're lucky that it's positioned where it is. We happen to be at a latitude where we're sort of at a continental crossroads, where we have many species that migrate through. We happen to represent the northern range limit for a number of species and the southern range limit for a number of other species. So it's sort of a nexus of diversity. And so it's really fortunate that the Virginia Coast Reserve happens to be at this latitude. When you look up and down the Atlantic coast, there's really no other place that represents this sort of intact ecosystem. We're lucky.
So all of this partnership here, the fact that this land has been protected for 50 years. In 1987, the National Science Foundation began funding the Virginia Coast Reserve as one of 27 long-term ecological research projects throughout the country. And basically, it's taking areas that have intact natural systems and looking at the impact of these systems to climate change. So we say that the Virginia Coast Reserve is a living laboratory. We have long-term data showing the effects of climate change on the barrier islands, the marshes, the oysters, the eelgrasses. And so we're able to demonstrate this research, this applied science, and this community engagement here because of this long-term protection. Next slide, please. Our marine habitat restoration, we have had success with oyster restoration as well as underwater grass restoration to the scale large enough to actually have an impact on the entire system. So we've been able to improve the underwater grasses and the oysters to a point that we really do support different fisheries. We have further improved water quality, and we've really created a state change within this natural system at the Virginia Coast Reserve. Next slide, please. Marine habitat restoration in terms of oysters. We've been doing oyster restoration for several decades here. We needed a hard substrate for these oysters to settle on, and the water quality there has been further improved by the great success we have had with oyster restoration. Next slide. We saw a complete decrease of wipeout of underwater grass species back in the 1930s due to a fungal disease and then storms. So we've gone from 0 acres of eelgrass to 9,000 acres of eelgrass, the largest restoration of seagrass on the planet, right here at the Virginia Coast Reserve. And I'll show a little video to tell you a little bit about that story. Next slide and video, please.
We're out here in really a world-class example of how a marine habitat can be brought back at a huge scale that really starts to change the whole way the whole system around it works. We are standing on top of a 4,000 acre underwater prairie that is 4,000 of 9,000 total acres that we have restored out here from 0 acres. We would never have been able to get this project going to the scale that we've achieved here had we not had really fantastic coastal water quality. And we have that coastal water quality in part because of our local community here. It takes good care of its own, and also in part because the Nature Conservancy started investing in this area and protecting these lands, these islands, these bays, all those years ago. We're out here.
So the Virginia Eastern Shore is also one of the most threatened regions in terms of climate change. We have sea level rise rates now in this natural landscape 2 to 3 times the global average, and of course increased frequency and intensity of storms. If you go to the next slide, you know, this natural protected area has its impacts due to climate change, and so does our community and the people that live here and our economy. So one more video and then we're going to wrap up. A couple more slides. Go ahead, Sam.
The Nature Conservancy was an early adapter here, providing leadership and advocacy for the preservation of the Lower Barrier Islands through acquisition, alone and in partnership. Now, the landscape here and the way of life it supports are threatened by a larger and more powerful force.
The intensity of coastal storms is increasing. There's no doubt about that. Frequency of coastal storms may also be increasing, and the barrier islands are protecting us as a buffer.
Cobb Island is probably the area that I work that's got the biggest change. The north side of Cobb Island, basically, maybe a half a mile is gone within just the past 10 years.
Understanding how these natural systems can help that, both in rural communities but also in cities like Norfolk and Hampton Roads, is really critical to adapting to climate impacts.
In concert with TNC's Virginia Coast Reserve, residents here are working to create new resiliency strategies, nature-based solutions for maintaining access to their homes and workplaces on roads subject to more frequent flooding from storm surge. The village of Oyster, where a number of island homes were relocated, is for now holding its own against ever-rising waters.
We project alternative scenarios for the future, and it could be 20 years from now or 50 years from now or 100 years from now, and finding ways to visualize that so people can understand the feedbacks of their actions, what they do. So it's not just about the coastal ecosystems operating in isolation. You've got to include how people are affecting them and vice versa.
Great, thanks. Next slide. So a living laboratory for coastal resilience as well. And the next few slides just really talk about our coastal resilience program and how involving this community, both in protection and then the research and the advocacy, customizing a tool to be able to look at scenarios of how these natural landscapes and infrastructure are being impacted by climate change, and then how we're using this place, this natural protected area, as a nature-based solution. Next slide. Very important to talk about community engagement and how protecting an area, even an extended area like the Virginia Coast Reserve, is really important, but having that community engaged in that is also very important. Next slide. And this is a tool that we have taken all that long-term data from the years of being a long-term ecological research program and created models and then public-facing apps that help us to predict future scenarios so we can plan for the future. And then next slide. And looking at things like eelgrass restoration and oyster restoration in terms of a resilience and an adaptation strategy. So a nature-based solution, placing these restored oyster reefs in areas that can actually protect shorelines of marshes that are ultimately protecting communities like you see behind here. So sort of stretching that oyster restoration into being a nature-based solution tool for resiliency. And I think that's the last slide. Yes, so thank you.
Yeah, great. We had one, I'm a little new at the question and answer and their hand raising. If you could write your questions in the question and answer that should be on your screen, and we will make sure that those get answered when we're all complete. Okay, without further ado, we're gonna travel south from the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic shore over to our Virginia Pinelands project. We'll have two speakers here. Brian Van Eerden is the director of the Virginia Pinelands program, who has a specialty in native species restoration, fire management, and longleaf pine. And Bill Owens is a private landowner in the same landscape who has a passion for longleaf pine restoration and has been a tremendous friend of the nature conservancies and many others through his private conservation, land protection and restoration efforts. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thanks, Sam. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We are gonna, like Sam said, take a swing to another ecosystem. This is a map showing priority, what we call whole systems in North America for the Nature Conservancy. Earlier this week, we heard about some projects in the Central Appalachian whole system in Western Maryland. And Jill just gave us a great tour of what's happening along our seaside coast. And we also heard about some Chesapeake Bay programs. What we're going to be talking over the next couple of minutes about in my session, also Bill Owen's session, is our longleaf pine whole system. And this extends from where I am, just a little bit south in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of Virginia, all the way down to Florida and along the Gulf Coast, the Gulf of Mexico coast over to East Texas. Next slide. So it's a massive conifer forest in southeastern United States. It's dominated by one pine species, longleaf pine, and we call it a forest, but through most of the range, this system was a savanna, park-like habitat, supporting a tremendous diversity of ground cover vegetation. Over 900 plant species are found here and nowhere else in the world. And that level of what we call endemism is really significant at the continental scale. And it's this global biodiversity significance that is why the Nature Conservancy is active and has been active for decades in this landscape. Historically, there were 400,000 hectares or it's nearly 100 million acres. I'll just stay with acres, 100 million acres of a longleaf pine forest across the range, again, from Virginia, Florida, and over to Texas. And today we only have roughly 4 million acres. So this is a very threatened system with a lot of rarity, and that adds urgency to our work. So it's the diversity and the rarity that brings the Nature Conservancy here. And looking forward in the face of climate change, we are looking at forest systems that have the resiliency to withstand droughts, increased hurricane, storm events, insect outbreaks, fire events, other kinds of disturbances that are being driven by climate change. And longleaf pine is a tree species that is very resilient to all those kinds of disturbances. So resiliency is another really important aspect to the system and why the Nature Conservancy is involved here. Next slide, please. So the Conservancy, and you've heard about from Jill and from the presenters earlier in the week, and the Conservancy is very active in the science of conservation planning, identifying the most strategic areas for the Nature Conservancy and our partners to invest resources to advance strategic, lasting, large-scale conservation. And this is a map showing the original range of the longleaf system, 100 million acres, and we have to decide, again, in a very strategic way, where should we invest our resources to establish anchors, resilient forest blocks across this entire range. And so we are working with leading ecologists to identify the highest priority sites across this 9-state area. Next slide. And that planning informs where we and our partners work. So when it comes to conservation action and how the Nature Conservancy, our state and federal agency partners, our private landowners, where we work and how we work, are informed through our conservation planning. And throughout this 9-state range of the longleaf pine system, the Nature Conservancy has helped establish 17 different what we call implementation teams. These are collaborative groups, public and private partners who are working together to protect land and to manage forest and restore natural processes that are critical for the health of this system. And this is the largest collaborative forest restoration projects work in North America. Next slide, please. So in each of these focal areas, and we have the Virginia Longleaf Cooperators, that's the name of our team, and Southeast Virginia is where we are working. The Nature Conservancy owns land, and we hope that we will have a chance to give you or provide a tour for those of you who can come overseas to see our lands, give you a tour of our Piney Grove Reserve, which is located in southeastern Virginia. And there we are protecting land to conserve biodiversity, but we're also using our lands, leveraging our lands to accomplish conservation at a greater scale. So we're sort of exporting the science and practices that we are establishing, developing on our properties. We're using our lands to inspire our partners and also our supporters to get involved, get engaged in forest conservation. And we also use our place-based presence to advocate for policy measures that advance land protection and forest management. And we have learned for a long time that being landowners and being very active in land management gives us really important credibility when it comes to talking to legislators and other policymakers. Next slide, please. Another really important element to our work is working with private landowners. So for the longleaf pole system and for almost all the other ecosystems where the Nature Conservancy is working in North America and really throughout the world, private landowners are the dominant landowners. So the most of the land is in private ownership. And here in the South, over 85% of the land is in private ownership. And if we're going to have success in getting to scale with having large blocks that are capturing the biodiversity of southeastern United States, we have to find ways to engage landowners in meaningful ways. And so the Nature Conservancy's role in this space, working with private landowners, we do a number of different things, but there are two primary ways that we engage private landowners, and that's through voluntary land protection. There are a lot of landowners who want to see their property permanently protected and still retain their lands, and so we work on what are called conservation easements, which you've heard about. So providing landowners a path to ensure that their properties are always protected. And then the other thing we do is we help secure support, financial support resources for landowners to do ecological management on their property. There are a lot of landowners who are very interested, very motivated to do conservation on their land, but sometimes it's a little overwhelming for landowners to know where to get the support and to navigate all the different channels that need to be explored to secure funding to advance conservation work on the land. So the Nature Conservancy, we play a role there in bringing resources to private landowners. And we are very fortunate throughout Virginia and really throughout the country to have conservation champions, private landowners who do just a tremendous amount of conservation work on their own lands and do a lot more to advocate for conservation beyond their properties. And Bill Owen is just a tremendous example of somebody who is a conservation champion for the longleaf hole system. You're going to hear from Bill about his property, and Bill is somebody who has become really the voice for longleaf pine conservation in Virginia and well beyond. And we're just grateful for the commitment that he's made to forest conservation and all he is doing in his own capacity to advance the work that's really so important to the Nature Conservancy and many, many other groups. So Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you from here on.
Good afternoon. My name is Bill Owen, and I'm delighted to share with you some of the work we've been doing on my family land. I'm a landowner in Sussex County, Virginia, which is about an hour's drive south of Richmond and an hour west of Jamestown and Williamsburg. It is a rural community, and its only industry is agriculture and forestry. The Nature Conservancy has identified a 10,000-acre project area here, which they call the Racoon Creek Pinelands, and my property serves as its core. Next slide, please. My land consists of 1,850 acres, or 750 hectares. About 53 hectares are agricultural, 12 hectares are in a pond, and about 670 hectares are forested. The center of this land was purchased by my grandfather to farm. My father enlarged it and farmed it, and I was raised on it and have also enlarged it. I'll share a quick secret with you. I hated this land when I was a child. Because I wanted to study music, I couldn't wait to get away from it to an urban center. I was educated in New England and Europe and enjoyed a career as a professional musician, primarily in the Philadelphia area. I inherited this land in 1998, and my initial instinct was to sell it. However, I first called the Nature Conservancy since I was familiar with the organization from my graduate student days in Connecticut, where I'd performed for several fundraisers. A young biologist named Brian Van Eerden had the misfortune of answering the phone that day. Brian came to the farm to meet me and to see the land. He introduced me to longleaf pine and explained that the property lies in its historic range and pointed out that the sandy soils provided an ideal environment for the tree. I retired in 2015 and moved back to Virginia. The farm and longleaf restoration has become my hobby, mission, and passion. Quite a change from my youth. It's funny the games life plays on us, isn't it? Next slide. When I look to the future, I dream about how this forest might appear in 100, 200, even 400 years from now. I donated a conservation easement to the Nature Conservancy to keep this land forever protected from development and subdivision. There have been rewarding tax advantages from this easement, which are a welcome bonus for doing things that I was going to do anyway. The property is managed for old growth longleaf pine and fire ecology and the restoration of the rich longleaf pine ecosystem. I am pleased that it is already being used as a demonstration site for longleaf restoration, and I hope this continues and will inspire others to be involved in this important conservation work. Next slide. This collaboration with the Nature Conservancy has been at the very center of various state and federal government partners who have assisted financially with this project. We now have over 1,250 acres or 500 hectares of longleaf in the ground, which we burn every 2 years. The guiding spirit for this project has been Brian Van Eerden from the Nature Conservancy, who has been my teacher, mentor, inspiration, and patient advisor for the past 22 years. Next slide. When I'm being philosophical, I like to consider the meaning of land ownership. It has certainly meant different things to many cultures around the world in the past. For instance, the Native Americans here in the United States pre-settlement could not understand the concept of an individual's owning land. Land was owned by the community or a tribe. Even today, everyone will agree that it is different from owning an object or even one's house. Should it be income producing? How much rights should government dictate our rights? Perhaps the only thing we can fully control is when we pass it along. At the very least, we are only temporary stewards of its care. My father, when he was complaining about how some landowner was abusing his land, would say that landowners have a moral and ethical obligation to leave their property in as good a shape as it was in when it was inherited or purchased. I like to carry that obligation one step further. I feel that we should feel obligated to leave it in better shape than it was in when we acquired it. Thank you very much, and please come to Virginia.
Bill and Brian and Jill, thank you very much. Bill, that was inspiring. And for those of you who are willing to take Bill's invitation up, I can assure you that coming to visit Bill in Yale, Virginia is a worthwhile trip. It's a beautiful place, and Bill, you've done amazing work. Thank you so much. We're gonna move over to the northern end of Shenandoah National Park, which is in somewhat in northern Virginia in the Central Appalachian Mountains. And we're gonna shift over to Amy Johnson, who is the program director of the Virginia Working Landscapes at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. So we're one of our partners in Virginia, a very important organization and a phenomenal place at Oxbow Farm. And once again, I'm sure we would love to show you this place as well. Amy, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you for the introduction. So I've got about 10 minutes here to tell you about a farm that I feel very passionately about. Through our work at Virginia Working Landscapes, we collaborate with landowners across the 16-county region here in Virginia to conduct research. And the program that I run is called Virginia Working Landscapes. We are a Smithsonian-based research program, so we collaborate with landowners, but also community volunteers and regional partners to generate and share knowledge that can inform best management practices for the conservation of our native biodiversity. So Oxbow Farm is one of our many sites that we work with. Now, together with partners, we are Virginia Working Landscapes. We have a whole network of folks that contribute to our work, but today I'll be focusing specifically on that relationship between private landowners and scientists. So Oxbow Farm is a 1,400-acre farm in Warren County, Virginia. They produce hay for the local equestrian community, as well as crops, cattle, some of the most beautiful horses you'll ever see, and also wildlife. The farm is owned by Beatrice and Adi van Gontard. They are also farmers and avid conservationists. And for those of you tuning in from Europe, they're part of the Friends of the Countryside group. So there's a variety of ways that Oxbow Farm contributes to conservation in the region through ecological research, as well as habitat restoration, so converting old fallow agricultural fields to native grasslands. And also they do a lot of landowner engagement, so bringing in groups of landowners where they can discuss current conservation management practices, challenges, opportunities. They have events and nature tours, so just constantly thinking of ways that they can help engage the community in conservation on private lands. But today we're really going to focus on the ecological research side of what they do on the farm. So we've been involved with Oxbow Farm for about 10 years, conducting research on the property and just looking at different ways that we can learn about how land management is influencing our region's biodiversity. So this is an example of one project we were working on this year in collaboration with American Farmland Trust and studying the nesting success of grassland birds. So species like bobolinks, like you see here, as well as grasshopper sparrows and eastern meadowlarks, and researching them in fields that are grazed and hayed, so fields that are actively used for agriculture. And we're doing this so that we can develop regionally relevant bird-friendly management practices for working farms. So what's really exciting about this project and doing it on private lands is the landowners are able to join us in the field as we're conducting this research. So Beatrice and Audie were in the field with us many days this summer looking for nests, monitoring nests, and monitoring the outcomes of these nests depending on which treatments they were in. We've also been working together with Oxbow on some animal movement research. So pictured here is an eastern meadowlark. They've declined by more than 70% since 1970s, and more than 80% of their habitat range-wide falls on private lands. So their successful conservation absolutely requires the engagement of the private landowner community. So along with partners from the Smithsonian's Movement of Life Initiative, as well as the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, we've been working to tag and band eastern meadowlarks, and Oxbow Farm is one of the locations where we've been doing this. So we've been using VHF or radio tags as well as GPS tags. And this allows us to learn more about their habitat use, not only here in the region, but also throughout their full annual cycle. How are they migrating? Where are they migrating to? And how is our land use impacting those species along the way? Another component that they're particularly interested in is restoration ecology. And this is probably the longest running study we've been doing with Oxbow Farm, along with partners from the University of Virginia, Virginia Master Naturalists, which is a local naturalist group, Virginia Tech University, as well as the Smithsonian Mason School of Conservation. And we've been looking at how meadow restoration and management of these fields is impacting our native biodiversity. So with our community volunteers, we've been able to study populations of birds, bugs, vegetation, and even the soil on Oxbow Farm, as well as on over 100 sites throughout the 16-county region. And these results are being used to help refine management recommendations specific to this region and specific to the habitats as well as the species that rely on these habitats. So how are we using all of this data that we're collecting in collaboration with landowners? To date, we've been using a lot of our bird data in particular to help develop recommendations for timing of management for grassland birds. So how can landowners optimize their fields to support grassland birds, both during the nesting season, so during the summer and spring, as well as during the winter when some of our migrants are coming down and relying on these wintering habitats. And then we're also working with our really talented team of interns and students to compile all of this data and share it in a way that tells a story about conservation and how scientists and landowners are working together to achieve that conservation. So you can visit our website to learn more about the results and how we're using those. So finally, I think this is the most important thing to discuss is really how is this benefiting us as researchers, and also how is it benefiting the landowners? So in the case of the landowners, working with scientists on different research projects on their properties allows them to gain knowledge, not only from the results that they learn from the research, but also in the field. I think I mentioned earlier, Beatrice and Adi join us in the field quite frequently, and as such are learning so much about the species and what they need to survive on the landscape, and just learning new things every day alongside our biologists. And that learning is actually very mutual. Our biologists at the same time are learning so much from the landowners that they can apply to the research. So through this research, the landowners are also able to develop connections, not only with biologists, but also with partnering organizations, and most importantly, with like-minded landowners in the region who are trying similar conservation practices on their properties and wanting to compare results and challenges. They're able to build a species list for their property. So as we're conducting this research, we're able to collect an inventory of all of the species we're finding. And it helps the landowners figure out how they want to manage their property specifically for those species. And finally, these collaborations allow them to contribute to the research from start to finish, which is a really rewarding process for both sides, I think. And then as far as benefits to the researcher, to gain site access like we're able to through private lands is huge for us. Scientists most often think that they're limited to public lands, and here in Virginia, we don't have as much public lands as you find out in the Western United States. So working with private landowners has enabled us to study a whole array of different habitats. We're also able to gain perspective from the landowners to actually help co-design the research, so that we're doing research that not only is generating new information, but it's also providing information that's applicable to the landowners we're collaborating with. We also have been able to get quite a bit of project support through our landowner community, whether it's through financial donations, whether it's through hosting events, or even hosting our interns and students so that we have spaces for them to live during the summer so they can do their research. And finally, conservation outreach. We are a very small staff on our team at Virginia Working Landscapes, but through our landowner community, they're constantly sharing the results of our work, as well as just the general conservation messaging and how to be better land stewards. And so through this network, we're able to really enhance our conservation footprint in the region. So here's my information. If you have any questions, and we run out of time during the panel, this is my email. And I just want to thank Beatrice and Adi von Guntard, who are the owners of Oxbow Farm and have allowed us to engage in this collaboration for a decade now, and are also really just setting the stage for other landowners to get involved. And they will be part of the Q&A panel coming up next, if you have any questions for them. So thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank all the panelists. I'd also just like to give Beatrice and Adi a minute or two to say a couple words if they choose. I think you're on mute.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Well, thank you, Amy. That was a great presentation, and we're just thrilled to be a part of Virginia Working Landscapes and use best management practices here on our farm to promote biodiversity. And we just are learning so much every year from the science that goes on here. And it's just so much fun to be a part of it. I mean, this year we were able to not only work with the biologists and scientists at Virginia Working Landscapes, but we also were able to help band 25 American kestrels and 5 baby barn owls who nested in our boxes and fledged from here this summer. And there's just so many interesting and fascinating things going on, and we are doing more to promote good stewardship of our land, like no-till farming, which we've been incorporating for quite a while to keep carbon sequestered in the ground, and the use of cover crops and not using pesticides, and then delaying the haying, as Amy mentioned, in many of our fields to promote the grassland birds. So we really are just so much enjoying our working relationship with Virginia Working Landscapes, and just what we're seeing, the beauty of nature surrounding us and what we're learning. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I might just add very, very quickly, Amy, I can't believe it's been 10 years. It's gone by so quickly, and we have learned so much through this association. We were intensive farmers 10 years ago, and we are continuing to still try to strike a balance between our farming needs and also keeping the habitat and keeping the biodiversity in place to allow for insects, wildlife, birds to survive. Some of our most enjoyable times on this farm are when Amy hosts a group of bird watchers on our farm, and it's amazing the numbers and diversity of these songbirds and field nesting birds, birds of prey, etc., that you don't even realize that are there and part of this, ecosystem that we have. And they're also very dependent on how we treat the system and manage the system. So I just can't thank Amy and her cohorts and the scientists that she's introduced us to awaken us to understand how fragile everything is, but how we can make a difference as well.
Well, thank you, Beatrice and I, for your stewardship of your lands, and let me turn it over to Sam for some other questions.
Okay, we have, thank you, Phil. Thank you also to the Vaughn Doctors. It's wonderful to see private landowners stepping up and doing this as well. It's a really wonderful thing. I'd love to come visit your farm.
We'd love to have you.
We'd love to have you.
I'm only an hour away. Okay, so let's jump into a couple of questions that we have already. We have one from Joseph. Joseph says, this is specific to Bill's presentation. So Brian or Bill, feel free to take this question. Would an easement with another partner other than TNC have been possible? And if yes, would there be any advantages to TNC for going down that road?
Well, the answer is yes. There are many agencies in Virginia that that have easements. My interest in the Nature Conservancy is that it's science-based, and that, for me, sort of overrides everything else. But there are government agencies and nonprofit agencies. Our forestry department, for instance, has the rights to have easements.
And I'll just add to that, of course, we're thrilled that Bill chose the Nature Conservancy to donate his easement to. And when the Nature Conservancy, as a nonprofit, when we take legal interest in a property, that enables us to be involved in land management on those properties. So it's not as easy for us to do that on lands where we don't hold an easement or we don't have a legal interest. So we can be stronger partners of private landowners if properties are under easement that we hold.
Right. So let me expand on that a little bit in that there are, as Bill mentioned, there are many non-government organizations and government agencies that hold easements. So the Nature Conservancy has a specific mandate for biodiversity protection, among other things. There are other organizations in Virginia and across the country, for example, a partner that we often work with called American Farmland Trust. They are specifically interested in protecting working farms. So they really look for and protect places that will remain in farming, in agriculture. So they've got that specific. There is another one, a big one in Virginia called the Virginia Outdoor Foundation, and they have a much broader focus and they protect open land. So they have less of a biodiversity mandate, but they really want open and green space. So the point of all that is that there are a lot of organizations that you can choose if you're a private landowner in the United States to work with to protect your land through conservation easements. let's see here. Just looking through the Q&A. That's all we have for questions at the moment. Does anyone else have any other questions they'd like to ask? Did I miss something, Phil?
Yeah, there's a question about are there local landowner associations and cooperations, active groups doing advocacy for the management of private properties more than for nature conservation?
Right, I'd answered that a little bit, and I'll kind of open that to the floor. I'm not sure who to pass that to. I answered it in the sense that there are, in certain landscapes across the United States, there are a lot of private landowner collaboratives, people that work together that aren't necessarily tied to a government agency or a nonprofit. So that does happen a lot, in particular in the Great Plains of the United States, in the center part of the state, where there's a lot of ranch lands. A lot of those landowners work together to manage their native grasslands for biodiversity and for and manage their cattle. Would any other presenters like to add to that?
Sure, well, I'll add to that, Sam. In our region, at least, we also have a lot of local non-for-profits that are focusing on advocacy specifically for private land conservation. Many of those involve our local land trusts, like the Piedmont Environmental Council, and there's a lot of landowners that are involved in that advocacy through those groups.
Any other we've got 2 more minutes. Let's see, oh, here we go. Here's a question, why get, let's see, why get, I need to translate this a little bit. Why is TNC such a trusted partner with landowners, and what makes this work? Phil, is that your reading of this question?
Yes, yep, that's good.
Phil, I think you might be you've had a long experience with the organization, and I think would be a good answer for this question.
Well, I think the key to why the private landowners trust the Nature Conservancy is that the Nature Conservancy is a private landowner itself, and we understand the challenges and the constraints and the obstacles that private landowners face, because we own and manage private lands in the form of nature preserves across the country. And having firsthand experience in trying to address those questions gives us credibility with private landowners. And that, I think, is the most important reason, but there are other reasons as well. We bring scientific information to help landowners, and as you've heard on the call this morning, and we also work to try to bring resources to bear on the management challenges that private landowners face through obtaining private grants and public grants, as well as trying to help landowners through trying to find other incentives through the form of tax incentives and other financial incentives. So I think there are lots of reasons why the Nature Conservancy is perceived as a trusted partner with private landowners.
Great, thank you, Phil. Maybe one last question. Maybe we have a bit for this, and I can answer this one. The question from Valerie says, do you have volunteers that you can rely upon to help with conservation in the field? And the short answer to that is absolutely. We use a lot of volunteers across the entire organization. Many thousands of volunteers help us in the field, whether they are doing seed collection in the Chesapeake Bay for grass restoration, or they're planting trees or conducting prescribed burning. I'm guessing that Amy probably also has volunteers that she works with the Smithsonian as well. So volunteer efforts are super important for conservation in the United States. And we do that for a number of reasons. To get work done, just first and foremost to get work done, but we also use it as a way to reach out to people and give them experiences out in nature so that they can connect with the places that we think are so important.
Yeah, and we're only a staff of 3 with Virginia Working Landscapes, and we have a team of more than 70 citizen scientists that help us every year with our research. So they're going into the field on these private lands and doing bird counts and vegetation surveys, and have really been an integral part of our program.
Great, thank you, Amy. Phil, I think we, well, there are no more open questions in the box there. I think I've got the technology figured out here. By the 1 hour into it, I think I might have it figured out. But I think we're done, Phil. Thank you very much.
I think we're at the top of the hour. And so I just want to thank all of the presenters, Sam, Jill, Brian, Bill, and Beatrice, and Adi. I really appreciate your presentations and your sharing your experience with us today on this call. So thank you very much for that. And I also want to encourage our viewers to tune in the same time and on the same station, if you will. On Monday, September 28th, we will have webinar number 3 in this series. And that webinar will focus on innovative case studies of private land conservation in Europe. So thank you all for your attention and listening in, and thank you to the presenters again for their wonderful sharing of their information.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.